Hello, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's Forest Space. Thank you for joining us for today's event. Welcome to the Plasticocene. It's a one-day interactive exploration of plastic, pollution, art, and law. And today's first part of today's event is a panel discussion on the role of policy, practice, and law in addressing plastic pollution. And just to help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube live from Forest Space, and we are located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. Here at Forest Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge, co-creating daily activities, projects, questions, things happening across the university. We're also running today's event as a live stream Zoom meeting, so those of you joining us there, your comments and questions, very important. Please pop those into the chat and we can read those out. Those of you here in the space, if you have any comments or questions later, just raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone around to you. Okay, with that, it's very much my pleasure to pass the microphone over to international lawyer, artist, performer, as well as a recently successfully defended INDI PhD in fine arts, Oonagh Fitzgerald. Oonagh, it's great to have you.
Thanks so much, Douglas, and welcome to all of you to the Plasticocene. Thanks for joining this panel on the role of policy, practice, and law in addressing plastic pollution. I'd also like to make a land acknowledgement. It's great that this is taking place, this exposition and presentation on the unceded Indigenous lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. And notwithstanding the threats from south of the border, our identity and future, happiness as a nation really depends on our commitment to full reconciliation with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Second, let me thank the amazing team at Fourth Space, Concordia University, Douglas Moffat, Jacqueline Webster, and Bertie Gregor for their encouragement and support in putting together this exposition. I've already been introduced. I'm Oonagh Fitzgerald. It's going to be my pleasure to introduce this panel. Before I do that, I'm just going to show you a few slides. This is not so much for the people who are in the room, but for those of you who are online, I'm just showing you some of the plastic art that's around the space here. I make a lot of art with plastic as a way to try and come to terms with the challenges we're living in. And so I'm just showing you a few of the images. This is picking up plastic on a beach and seeing how much there is. This is attending the conference and one of the UN environmental program conferences on plastic pollution. You'll hear more about that from Alexandra, who's been following this much more closely than me. And a lot of the art in this room is made from one of these plastic bouncers that you find on lakes across Canada. I found one in somebody's ditch. They were throwing it away, and I made a lot of stuff out of it. This was me trying to get inspired, think what I could do. And these are the crazy images and creatures that came up. So that's it for my slides. And if you're in the room, obviously, you can see these things for yourself. So do I close it? Oops, yeah. And so it's now my pleasure to introduce you to our four speakers. So I'll just introduce them all first, and then we'll turn to each one to present. So in order that we're going to have our first presentations, we have Melissa DeYoung online. She's the Chief Executive Officer, Pollution Probe, and she connects with policy, not legal frameworks, on this pollution problem. She works for a not-for-profit working on plastic pollution since 2006, especially freshwater systems, cross-border collaboration in running a large program on Great Lakes plastic cleanup. Second, in person in the room with me, we have Faisal Shennib. He's a doctoral researcher at the Center for Creative Reuse, environmental operations at the campus sustainability program. He looks at local and provincial level activities to sort and manage plastic waste and the utility of artificial intelligence in sorting and managing waste. Also online, we have Melissa Gorrie, Law Reform Manager and Circular Economies Project Lead at Ecojustice Canada. She advocates for transformative legal reforms that protect the health and well-being of people and planet and uphold Indigenous rights and sovereignty. And she's an observer at the UN Global Plastics Treaty negotiations, co-founder of Waste Free Edmonton, a nonprofit that successfully advocated for a municipal single-use bylaw. And last but not least, we have Alexandra Harrington, lecturer in law at Lancaster University Law School, chair of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law Agreement on Plastic Pollution Task Force. She works on international law and policy perspectives about oceanic pollution, small island nations, advocacy for the development of an international treaty to eliminate plastic pollution. So we're going to have an amazing discussion about all the different dimensions of trying to solve this problem through policy, engineering, and law. So let's start with Melissa DeYoung online, and she's going to first introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her journey with this problem of plastic pollution.
Great. Thanks so much, Oonagh. I'm just going to pull up my slides here. Hopefully, is that visible?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. Perfect. So thank you so much for the introduction and really pleased to be here today. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but glad to have the option to join virtually and to talk a little bit about the work that Pollution Probe has been doing on plastic pollution and more specifically plastic pollution in our freshwater systems. As Oonagh mentioned, my name's Melissa. I'm Chief Executive Officer at Pollution Probe. I stepped into the role not very long ago, and before that, I was leading our circular economy and our water programs for about 7 years. And under those programs, we have a lot of initiatives currently underway, but a big one that we'll focus on a lot today is our Great Lakes Plastic Cleanup, which is a binational effort led by our organization and the Council of the Great Lakes region. But before I get into that, I just wanted to introduce Pollution Probe very quickly for those of you not familiar with us. We are Canada's longest standing environmental not-for-profit organization. We were formed back in 1969 by a group of students out of the University of Toronto. And we work very closely together with governments, industry, and the public, all with a commitment to clean air, clean water, and a healthy planet. And we have a very long record of working on various environmental issues, including waste management. We did coin the phrase reduce, reuse, recycle back in the 1970s, which is now used internationally and communicates the steps you can take to deal with your waste once you have finished with a product. We are also very well known for our role in developing Ontario's Blue Box program back in the 1980s. And I will touch on this more obviously throughout the discussion today, but more recently, a lot of our work has been rooted in addressing plastic pollution, again, in freshwater ecosystems and supporting the transition to a circular economy. And when we look at plastic pollution and any environmental issue that we're working on, we really work to take a holistic approach and to take into account the different perspective and the different efforts being undertaken by governments and civil society, academia, and industry, and working very closely with all of those groups. Our work related to plastic pollution specifically began back in about 2018, and we were having discussions at that time with a number of groups located around the Great Lakes region about the attention that was being given to oceans plastic. And obviously there's a huge problem with plastic in the ocean, and it's incredibly important that we're addressing that. But we knew there was also a story to be told about freshwater plastic pollution. Microplastics and plastics in freshwater systems like our Great Lakes can have significant impacts on ecosystems and wildlife and human health. And whatever's happening in our freshwater systems eventually finds its way out into the ocean where it contributes to that broader scale problem. And this is an area that Pollution Probe has been working very hard to increase attention about over the past many years so that there's equal attention and effort being put towards addressing freshwater pollution as there is to addressing ocean plastic. The Great Lakes are our largest freshwater system in the world, so they're incredibly important. And just a few numbers on sort of how plastic pollution is impacting the Great Lakes. researchers have estimated there is around 10 million kilograms of plastic that is entering the Great Lakes each year, and that the majority of that are microplastics. And the concentrations of those microplastics are believed to be on par with what are being found in our oceans gyres and our oceans garbage patches. More than 80% of the litter that's found during Great Lakes shoreline cleanups is plastic. And there have been quite a few studies that have come out over the past few years that have looked at the prevalence of microplastic in water samples. One in Lake Ontario from 2023 showed that 90% of samples contained microplastics. And there are other studies focused on wildlife and including fish. There was a brown bullhead catfish in Hamilton Harbor as part of a study in 2021 that they found over 900 pieces of plastic in a single fish, which was a record at the time. I think they have since found in other studies larger quantities in the digestive tracts of fish from various locations. And there's also a huge economic piece to this. Obviously, cleaning up plastic once it's found its way into the environment is incredibly costly. And whether that's, requiring beach cleanup or lake cleanup or stormwater capture devices, educational campaigns, there's a lot of resources that need to go into dealing with this issue. So back in 2018, we convened what was called the Great Lakes Plastics Forum, which was attended by over 50 leaders and decision makers from government and industry and civil society, academia. And the goal was really to get a lay of the land of what was the current understanding of plastic pollution in the Great Lakes, where were there already efforts underway to address the issue, what were some of the main challenges, and what were some of the opportunities. So a lot of the things that we're talking about here today. And for our organization coming out of that forum, we had a really good understanding of sort of the role that we could play to complement the efforts of those who were also at the table. And for us, that was taking our holistic approach and looking at how we can better educate and come together with communities directly to address the issue. So with that in mind, in 2020, we launched our Great Lakes Plastic Cleanup together with our partners, the Council of the Great Lakes Region. And the initiative is really centered around a combination of piloting plastic capture technologies and collecting vital and critical data and information on what it is we find so that we can better understand sources and pathways, and then working very closely to engage communities in that discussion. We started the initiative with around 37 sites, and we've now grown to more than 225 sites across the binational Great Lakes region. We did expand into the US a couple of years ago, where we're piloting plastic capture technology and working on the ground with communities. And one of the greatest strengths of the initiative is that it's really built around a strong network and collaboration. We have about 140 collaborators that we're working with, again, both in Canada and in the US. And those include governments, business, industry, technology providers, academic institutions, community groups, Rotary clubs, youth, the list goes on and on. So we really do have people participating in this initiative from all different sectors and bringing all different types of expertise and knowledge about plastic pollution and what that means to them to the table. Making use of the plastic capture devices, we have some that are meant to stop plastic from entering the lake, and we have others that collect it once it has found its way there. And we collect data on every piece that we work together with communities to sort and characterize. So we pull the debris from the devices and count all of the different types and pieces. And that gives us a really good understanding of what's happening not only across the Great Lakes, but lake by lake. But again, one of the most important pieces, and we'll get into this more today, is really that opportunity to engage with communities, to have them come out and be a part of this initiative, to see what plastic pollution looks like. I've just thrown this slide up, but these are some of our numbers over the past 5 years, our impact, the number of people we've reached, the number of plastic pieces we've removed. And I know we'll get into that a bit more in a while, so I won't spend too much more time there. And then just very quickly, I'm not going to go into detail on this, but these are just some of the other initiatives that we currently have underway working on plastic pollution, which again, I believe will probably come up throughout the discussion today. But we have an important education initiative together with the Toronto Zoo and Green Mantra Technologies, which is located on site at the Toronto Zoo. That's not only looking at plastic pollution, but also highlighting innovative efforts that are already underway or in the market to address plastic pollution and make use of hard to recycle plastics. We are working to engage the fishing community and better understand their unique perspective and experience with plastic pollution. We are part of the Canada Plastics Pact and working in collaboration with partners there to support the transition to a circular economy for plastic, and more specifically plastic packaging. And then we are also undertaking various policy-related efforts, one of them being in collaboration with the Chemistry Industry Association of Canada to better address pre-production plastic pellets in the environment. So keeping time in mind, I will leave it there and look forward to talking a bit more about this as we get into the discussion.
Thanks so much, Melissa, for that great introduction to the work of Pollution Probe and your involvement in it. Let's turn now to Faisal Shennib for your discussion.
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Faisal, and I'm very glad to be here and humbled to be here with such amazing guests. And Oonagh, congratulations on your successful defending of your thesis. Incredible. So my work is like both more general and more local than I think what we're talking about here, in the sense that I'm looking at waste management more generally than plastics, but plastics is a big component of that. And circular economy, and specifically data-driven technologies like AI. And can they actually help us do better, or are we just going to create more junk and more emissions in the process? So I'll quickly cycle through a little bit of what my research is about. And I think the button is not working. I'm pressing it.
Oh, which button? Is it
the forward
that's the one
button?
it should be. Yeah, it's working.
Oh, now it's working. Great. Did I
Slight
go too
delay.
far? There we go. Yeah. Okay, let's start again. Okay, so my research scope, my background, by the way, is as an engineer, a civil engineer, mechanical engineer, and then I started this PhD after working in sustainability operations for 15 years here at Concordia University, trying to inch the community forward in terms of some key topics we want to do better at, specifically waste. How do we get to this idea of zero waste? Do we really need waste? Through the years, I kind of realized that digital technologies are coming up. AI was becoming really popular. And I wanted to see if we could do some studies to test really their validity as an approach. So the scope of my research is not like the away site of waste management, like the facilities. It's really where you and I are making those decisions on waste. And the other part of it is, so we're not only testing these tools, we're actually developing tools here at Concordia with students and professors collaborating to see what we can make and whether they're effective or not. We're also addressing the question, like I mentioned, on whether the environmental, economic, and social costs of this technology is worth it, right? So right now, this technology is proliferating out there a little bit, but nobody's really measuring, does this stuff help as much as it's hurting? So that's the basic question behind my research. The inspiration started, like, let's say, I think it was 8 years ago. We started to hear like press releases about robotics companies creating this technology that would be implemented in waste management sorting facilities. We call them MRFs, material recovery facilities, where they sort recyclables. And that technology was quite old at the time. And so there was this idea that robotics could use computer vision, like a robotic eye, to detect what there is and sort it in the right category instead of humans doing that. And then that economy would be really beneficial to society and help us sort better. So you wouldn't have to do it. The facility would do it better, and that would solve our problem. But then I thought, that's not great. Like, we want to connect with our materials and understand this whole system. We don't want to put the problem away. So what if we embedded that technology into where we dispose of materials? And it turns out there are some companies doing that, that are developing smart waste bins that either give you feedback or try to sort the materials right there and then. You could also have it in a cell phone app. So a few people have tried to develop apps that tell you what to throw away. They identify the materials using computer vision and give you localized sorting instructions. That's something we're working on here. under this banner of open waste. We call it the research project. And there on the right is a popular Canadian company called Intuitive AI's product that is also like a smart bin that gives you sorting instructions. I think you can see it at like Tim Hortons sometimes. And I started thinking, well, one of the challenges I have as a professional here at Concordia is I have to conduct these waste audits. You call them characterization sometimes. So Melissa was talking about characterizing water plastics from the water that they're collecting. It's a really labor-intensive and annoying and stinky process, and it doesn't happen very much because it's very difficult to do, and it takes expertise and a lot of people. And what that ends up meaning is that we don't actually have a lot of great data on waste. We collect tonnage a lot of times, automatically weighed figures on how much we send in trucks to facilities, but we don't really know what it's composed of unless we do a characterization. So this technology could also help us understand the composition of what we're throwing away better, which is really important in addressing the issues, including plastics, right? Plastic contamination and waste is one of the main reasons we're not recycling very well, because there's so many different things mixed together with the wrong things in there. So we need to understand the characterization of our waste in order to do better. So anyway, these technologies are being proliferated by vendors, but I thought, we also need a community-based approach to this technology, or could benefit from it. What if we had open source software and technology that allowed this technology really to be adopted widely? What if it was cost effective and something that communities everywhere could benefit from, rather than it just being something that's sold to you, right, to make a profit? Maybe that's the wrong drive, because this problem is huge. And if it's really going to help address this problem, I think we need an open approach. So I'm imagining this ecosystem of open source software and technology that helps us get better data, and that the data is open and available for everybody to share, and allows for opportunities to do better, not only at the big scale, but really locally, right? If we understand what materials are circulating locally better, we might be able to design better interventions, and maybe as individuals and communities recirculate materials very locally. So that's very abstract, but I think it's an important concept that underlies what I'm pushing for. One of the things we do at Concordia is we have a reuse center, Concordia University Center for Creative Reuse, that we started many years ago. It's very simple, the concept. It's a space for materials to pause in that are generated at Concordia, and people have the opportunity to come and visit and shop, but it's actually free. And so it covers the gamut of pretty much anything we generate here. So it can be sort of raw materials, but it can be products as well. Not very high value things generally, but sometimes high enough that it adds up. And we saved the communities around $500,000 over the years of operation. I think it's 8 years now. So that's substantial, and a lot of weight's worth of material. So this is the kind of initiative we'd like to see more of. But thinking about AI and application, we started thinking, is there a way AI can help in this context as well, maybe? We don't actually know in detail what's in our facility. So can AI help us inventory better? That's a question we could use. Can it help track what we're sending out there and get better engagement, right? So we're going to test out training a model on what we send in there and send out to see if that can help make the reuse center more efficient. So this is sort of a mock-up of automation of tracking what we have in our very, randomly organized center. It's a very lean operation with not a lot of staff, and a lot of these operations are very underfunded. So they can use all the help they can get. Also, we have these bins out in the wild of Concordia where you can drop things off. So it could be interesting if you're picking things out of these bins, which we encouraged to happen all the time. We don't necessarily want you to have to go all the way to the reuse center. What if you could just scan the materials you were putting in there or putting out, helping us track the impact of these initiatives anywhere, right? So that's sort of the direction I want to see things heading, because when you track things, you justify things, right? It's hard to invest things if you can't say what the impact is. So it's really important that we start measuring our waste, not only to understand it, but to justify initiatives. The last idea I'm going to throw out here is, what if we nudged people to reuse more instead of buying new more through the same kind of systems we use to get people hooked on social media and on programs like Netflix, right? Watch this show if you like this show. I mean, our consumption is pushed by Amazon and companies like that to consume more new products. We can do the same and be creative and think of ways to reuse better through this technology. So
I love that concept. Thanks so much, Faisal. That was really interesting. And now we have Melissa Gorrie online to talk about the work of Ecojustice Canada.
Right, thank you so much. I'm just gonna share my screen here and get my presentation up, hopefully. All good?
Perfect.
Give me a second, hopefully. Yay. All right, yeah, thanks for having me here, all the way from Treaty 6 territory here in Amiskitchewan, or what's known colonially as Edmonton. So yeah, I'm here to talk about my work, primarily my work as a law reform manager and project lead for the Circular Economies project with Ecojustice Canada, and also as a co-founder and board member of Waste Free Edmonton. So I think it's important to first always situate yourself in when you're coming into a space and what perspectives you're bringing to the table. So I am a fourth generation settler of European descent, as I mentioned here on Treaty 6 territory. I've been an environmental law practitioner with Ecojustice since 2010. I have a background in neuroscience and psychology, then going to law school, and I completed my Master of Laws thesis work in after working for many years in 2022, and in that space was looking at actually how to decolonize environmental legal theories and environmental law practices from a settler lens. And prior to that, I also co-founded Waste Free Edmonton in 2018, and I'll talk a bit more about both organizations that I'm with in the coming slides. But I'll just say I've been working in the environmental sphere for quite some time, in the environmental law and policy sphere particularly. So yeah, I don't know if folks know about Ecojustice, but we are Canada's largest environmental law charity. And our mission is to use the law to defend nature, combat the climate crisis, and fight for a healthy environment. And so we have traditionally been kind of a litigation shop. So in my previous work, I worked primarily as a litigator representing clients in court. So I'm trying to uphold laws to protect species at risk, environmental rights, the whole gamut. We work in all spheres of environmental rights, environmental justice. More recently, our organization has shifted to focus also on pushing for better laws through law reform and government relations work and campaigning with local communities. And that's where the focus of my work has been for the last number of years as law reform manager. And we also have a very strong strategic communications branch that partners with our litigation and law reform folks to ensure that our work is really strategic and effective. The other organization is much smaller and local in scale. I honestly, Waste Edmonton came about because I just got so tired. I was almost like traumatized going into grocery stores where I didn't even want to go, and I would send my partner because I was just so sick of seeing the proliferation of single-use everything and people pulling out those little secondary bags to put their produce in that didn't need it. And I just got to a point where I felt like instead of complaining constantly about the particular issue, wanted to just try to do something. And the timing was right, where there was a counselor who was interested in pushing forward a single-use bylaw in Edmonton, and there were some other folks that I connected with. And so we really started from there, wanting to address that particular problem. But really, when I think about the organization, we talk about reducing waste, but looking back, we really were focused on addressing like the overconsumption problem and the unnecessary consumption problem. And I think the top of the waste hierarchy often gets kind of forgotten. And we focus so much on waste diversion and dealing with what we already have, as opposed to looking at why we are producing so much and consuming so much in the first place and tackling that at the front end. So yeah, this is some of our wonderful volunteers, 100% grassroots, off the side of my desk. Something is very much a passion project, but really proud of the work that we've done over the last number of years. So I also just wanted to frame, before talking about the particular work that I've done, kind of where my perspective coming to look at plastic pollution. Definitely not looking at it from an AI lens, looking at it really at more of a life cycle approach and looking at again, like I mentioned, the front end as a very important piece. So the extraction and transport of fossil fuels, like at the front end where we are sourcing what is used for plastic in the petrochemical industry. And then how that is then refined and used, and obviously the distribution and use, and then the end of life and how plastics is used. And so being really mindful of the fact that we need to look at the full life cycle. And that includes looking at the health impacts. And I think it was really interesting hearing the other Melissa speak at the beginning about freshwater impacts and how that's often forgotten. And so obviously, looking at impacts to all forms of life, not just human life. But I think in the work that I've been doing, part of it has been highlighting the impacts to communities, and particularly racialized and otherwise disadvantaged communities in the full life cycle of plastics. We importantly need to look at what's happening, for example, to in our waterways and to seabirds and sea life. And I can't even watch another documentary where they pull plastic out of a bird or a fish. Like I want to throw up. So not saying that that is not totally important, but I think when you have the news cycles or whatever, that's the stuff that is often focused on as the plastic problem. But the plastic pollution problem is the full life cycle, and it's also the impacts to humans and the stuff that you might not necessarily be able to tangibly see in a picture in terms of the emissions that are coming from a facility where they're extracting or processing these toxic chemicals and creating these resins and these products, and the implications for human health need to be highlighted alongside the impacts at more of the back end and the waste that we're seeing in our waterways. And so this is just a graphic that from the Center for International Environmental Law. There's a lot of great advocacy that's just kind of highlighting some of the impacts. I won't go through this in detail either, but again, just like the importance of remembering that the serious impacts of plastics, like I think the industry they put a lot of money into trying to not highlight the fact that we are dealing with primarily unregulated chemicals, and a lot of what we're creating is like a toxic soup that, particularly when you're talking about food products and clothing and for children, that are leaching out and biomagnifying and bioaccumulating in our bodies and the bodies of other beings, and the fact that they're linked to so many health issues related to heart disease, neurodevelopmental conditions, fertility, cancers. And the issue of microplastics and nanoplastics is getting more and more attention. And I've seen a couple times now a documentary on that I think it's called Plastics People, actually, and the science around how it's just everywhere. It's broken the blood-brain barrier. It's in every part of our body, right? And what are the implications of that? It's really scary to think about. The other thing I want to flag is, again, in terms of the impacts to communities, I'll talk more about our work at INC, the INCs, which are the UN Global Plastic Treaty negotiations, essentially. But we've partnered with DeYoung First Nations, which is a nation that has been significantly disproportionately impacted by plastic production. One of the United Nations special rapporteurs actually referred to it as a sacrifice zone. It's called Chemical Valley because 40% of the chemical facilities in so-called Canada are located there. And these images show where, can you imagine like playing hockey with that level of a facility in your backyard? They have so many health issues. They have the monitors. There's been times where they've had to shut down the daycares and the city council offices numerous times because there's these crazy spikes in benzenes, which are a well-known carcinogen. And really, there is no safe level of benzene. So these communities, and I've worked with them, and I've seen the worry on their faces and the heartbreak when they feel like they can't control what is happening in their community. They are being really sacrificed for the petrochemical industry and for the continued plastic production. We also need to think about the disproportional impacts, not just in so-called Canada and how certain communities are where the facilities are being located, but also how we are exporting our waste problem and waste colonialism and environmental racism. We've seen in the news over the last number of years how we are trying to export our plastic waste and make it someone else's problem, and the health impacts that we're seeing and the biodiversity impacts to the global south are very significant and severe. I also just want to flag, it's because it seems to get lost in the conversation sometimes. Again, the industry does a really good job of like trying to bring it back to, well, recycle better and we just need better systems for waste management. And it's just, there's so much myth busting that needs to happen, and more, I think, greenwashing claims need to be brought forward, because the reality is that, over 90% of plastic is not recyclable. It's downcycling. You can maybe, recycle it once into a bench, but it's not like glass. It's not like other things where you can continually recycle it. And things like advanced recycling and chemical recycling, you need to be very careful around. There's no real proven technologies in that regard. I have a lot of concerns about that framing and making sure that we're, again, not focused on the back end and doing better recycling, but stopping the production at the front end. So on that note, I'll just briefly touch on some of the work that I've been doing with that framing. So again, I mentioned we have a single-use bylaw in Edmonton now. This is just some of the examples. We're out there with the plastic bag man. This man is wearing stilts covered with plastic bags, getting signatures for our petition. And then one of other pictures showing us at City Hall with the thousands of signatures that we had. We just had a huge campaign over a year, all volunteer run. And as a result, we do have one of the leading bylaws municipally, one of the most advanced ones that we have in Canada. I won't go over the details, but it's pretty comprehensive. And one of the things I like about it is that it requires that reusables be provided for dine-in, and that they have to accept customers' reusables, because we were having issues where companies would say, oh, we don't know if we can accept, sorry. You have to take a single use, and it was just for no real reason. So now they have to accept it. So it's a small thing, but it is a step in the right direction. The other thing, we do a lot of work in Ecojustice. We're actively representing clients in the 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 constitutional challenge around the federal restrictions on single-use plastics, and we're very active in that space, but I don't particularly work on that myself, and I know we're limited in time. So I just wanted to focus on my work at the United Nations Plastic Treaty negotiations. So, and I know the next speaker is very involved and will probably speak on this more, so I'll just touch on it from my perspective. But that we do have a mandate from UNEP to create a legally binding agreement to address the full life cycle of plastic pollution. And the INC process has been going on for a few years now. I participated in the 4th round of negotiations in Ottawa last year. And so I just wanted to put this up here to show kind of where things have been going in terms of the plastic treaty negotiations. This is draft text that we had to negotiate. I won't say me, I was an observer. I'm there as an observer, not there as a member state, obviously. But this is the one portion of the draft treaty text that, after a bunch of back and forth, a bunch of countries contributing, the INC Secretariat, doing their best to try to take all of this input and make something. As a lawyer, I look at this and I go cross-eyed, and I like reading text. You can see how there are all of these bracketed parts and optional alternative language. If you're looking at this and saying, I don't really know what this means, I can't make sense of it, nobody really can. It's an example of how challenging it has been to get parties to agree to draft language in an international agreement to address plastic pollution, where everybody is throwing in different alternatives. We have countries who are high ambition, who are really advocating for strong measures to address plastic pollution at the front end. And then you have countries who are very much trying to prevent anything being mandatory, everything being discretionary, left to countries to determine on their own, focus just on waste management, don't want to see anything about plastic production, about human rights, human health, Indigenous rights. So we're just seeing a very challenging process and not a lot of progress in terms of actually getting to treaty text. And we can talk more about that. I'm happy to talk more about that. I could talk all day about this, but just to show, we were there again with DeYoung First Nation, and you can see this powerful, with that art sculpture that Oonagh actually showed in the background, with a sign that was made saying, let DeYoung breathe, shut down INEOS, which is one of the main facilities that was operating in their territories and crossing out the word benzene. So they're supporting them and their advocacy to have a treaty that meaningfully supports their rights and addresses the atrocities that are happening in terms of the human rights and Indigenous rights and human health violations happening on their territories. So it was a really powerful thing to be involved in. INC 5, the 5th round of negotiations, happened in Korea last November. And again, a lot of lobbying by industry and low ambition countries. Progress was very limited. But there was some high points in terms of Canada and many other countries signed on to proposed language that would actually ensure that there was a provision on addressing plastic production in the treaty and chemicals of concern, and a lot of great advocacy by Indigenous peoples and grassroots organizations such as ours. And just some images of our participation there, because it's always nice to see some photos. And up at the top right, that was a whole bunch of, coalition INGO members, rights holders from across the world that were coming together to advocate on this. And so, yeah, the next stop is INC 5.2, they're calling it, because they couldn't finalize by INC 5, which was the original mandate. So they're doing it again in August in Geneva, and over 10 days, we're going to see if what we have in terms of a mess of treaty text can actually, there has been a lot of efforts to lean down, and there are provisions on there are proposals on the table that if it could actually be adopted, could move things forward. But because it's a consensus-based process, it makes it really hard because you have so many countries that are standing in the way of progress. So yeah, I'll leave it there. And thanks so much. Looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thanks so much, Melissa. And I should just make a plug for one of the musical dimensions of this exposition. Philon Nguyen has composed a 30-minute piece of music, which is, he uses his musical composition and he feeds it into an AI system. And I gave him a text, which was the text of some of that treaty, the draft treaty with all the square brackets, and where they are saying open square brackets, close square brackets all throughout. Anyway, you have to listen to this. It's quite excruciating, but it's also amazing. And it's just a commentary on this terrible text. Anyway, thanks for that, Melissa. And now we have Alexandra. Over to you.
Thank you, Oonagh. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for having me here. Thank you to everyone for organizing this and all of you for being here. And I do think I need to listen to that piece of music, although it will not be as horrible as being in the room for all of it, but it may bring back all the memories. So I don't have slides just because I wanted to have a quick conversation with those of you in the room and also those online about the treaty process. I will give you a bit of my background first, but then also about the treaty process. Because I think at this point it's so critical, but it's also so confusing. It's so confusing for all of us as well as people who are not in that space. That just a bit of perspective is really helpful. And even for the countries that I advise, for the organizations I advise, we're still at this point of kind of taking a step back now, looking at it and figuring out what we want and how do we get there. But I think the beginning of that story is just to explain how I can give you insights and what insights I can give you. So I am, as Oonagh mentioned, the world's longest title to go with a very long name. But I am the chair of a task force, or the task force that within the International Union of Conservation of Nature, we have a number of different commissions, and one is focused entirely on environmental law. It's the World Commission on Environmental Law. So we have a task force that was created in advance of these negotiations to work with the IUCN, which is an intergovernmental organization, which is a global organization that promotes biodiversity, nature, conservation, et cetera, throughout the world, and in small communities as well as at the global level. So very much kind of wrapping up all we've heard today. And we really need to chat a lot more. I need ideas from you. But we created the task force to work as part of the IUCN delegation and also to guide the legal elements of IUCN's position and our member states, because IUCN is quite unusual. It's quite unique in that we have members that are countries. We have members that are organizations, both private sector, in some cases, organizations and entities, as well as NGOs and civil society members, some universities, et cetera. And we also have individuals. So I am a member as well as now working in other capacities. So it is an effort to bridge everyone together. And so to advise our members, we also work with them and produce a number of different documents, legal texts, proposals, also legal briefings, etc. In the course of this work, I have also had the great privilege and continue to have this really amazing privilege to work with 5 countries in West Africa very closely, to advise them through a program that we are running with Grid Arendal in Norway and the government of Norway through NORAD, which is their outreach funding, overseas funding mechanism, to provide them with legal advice and in one case actually representation during the negotiations process. So those countries are Senegal, Sierra Leone, Sao Tome and Principe, Cabo Verde, and Guinea-Bissau. And I actually am a member of the legal drafting group, which we'll get to in a minute, for Guinea-Bissau. So I am able to provide them with support throughout the process and sit there as a member for them and a representative for them when they need advice or when they need someone to speak, but I prefer them to actually speak since I am not a citizen there. So we have this really interesting position for the negotiations. I've also had the chance to work with a number of different organizations on multiple topics. So biodiversity, also trade issues, subsidies issues, governance issues, the rules of procedures issues, all of these things at this point. And there are many, and this is what happens when we also have a very complex text. And it is actually very interesting to hear your reflections, and particularly Faisal, because there are so many crossovers with the countries that I'm representing that I think we really need to think of how this can be much more broadly applied and how what you're learning and what you're doing here can be taken outside. So many more chats, I think, to follow. But just in terms of the process quite quickly, the process, as Melissa pointed out in her slides, began in 2022. It began much earlier with kind of background work and background negotiations. But in 2022, we had the UN Environment Assembly, which is basically the governing organization for the UN Environment Program, authorize in Resolution 514 the conduct of a negotiation with the goal of having a plastic treaty, what we term an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. I should point out, not only in the marine environment. And certainly the first militia presentation pointed out the need for freshwater resources as well. We also know land and soil and a number of other different things. The ask in that resolution was that we negotiate this until the end of 2024 over the course of 5 different rounds. And the 2024 bit, obviously we've gone through. The 5 rounds is a bit of an interesting procedural fudge we'll get to momentarily. It's lawyers being lawyers. Anyway, with that in mind, we then opened up the initial set of negotiations in 2022 in Uruguay and Punta del Este, and then moved on to have various rounds in Paris, in Nairobi, in Ottawa, which is where I got to reconnect with Oonagh after a long time, and most recently in Busan in the Republic of Korea. At each of these, the idea generally was, and the practice typically is, you start off, you have an open discussion about what should be in the treaty, and the resolution itself did talk about a full life cycle treaty, so the full life cycle of plastics, not only waste management. It did stress that. And I stress that because a number of countries are really trying to be quite adamant that it should only be a waste management treaty, but it is indeed authorized to be the full life cycle. Typically, we would have 1 and maybe 2 negotiation processes that were open, and then we would have text that was proposed, and we would move through that text, and we would have a treaty. Unfortunately, geopolitically, the world changed, obviously, since the adoption of UNEA Resolution 514. It changed in many ways, with many conflicts and then an election. But even before the election, the conflicts did obviously start playing into some of these relationships. And we also saw rules of procedure becoming very important in ways that only lawyers could love, truly, in terms of being kind of stalling mechanisms or procedural blocks for making progress on a lot of the text. And that is why when we got to Ottawa, we had the treaty text that was shown on the screen. Actually, what came out of Ottawa was even longer. So after Ottawa, which was intended to be the second to last session where we should have had a lot of treaty text available already. We didn't have that. And there was actually the authorization of a number of different, well, 2, but subgroups, intersessional working processes. So a very concentrated group of experts. I was again lucky to be one of those, to sit and talk about what options might be there for, in this case, financing, and then also science and the regulation of science in the treaty. So how do we regulate plastic pollution? How do we define plastic or plastic pollution? Should we include chemicals of concern in the treaty text itself? How do we regulate product design? Or do we regulate product design? So over the course of a very intensive month, we had a number of different online meetings, and then we had a week in Bangkok to try to hash this out as experts, not as a negotiation, but as experts. By default, it does, of course, become a negotiation, but it's not meant to be. The result was that we didn't have a great deal of movement on any of those topics. So the treaty text that Melissa showed you was emblematic of what came out of Ottawa. What is difficult to understand, and what I wanted to kind of highlight, is that from that point onwards, so from the end of August onwards, the chair of the negotiation process himself, there is a designated chair, and this actually was a rotating chair. So we had a different chair for the first 3, and then we switched over for 4 and 5, decided to create what he termed a non-paper, which is very legally confusing. It's confusing for lawyers. It was called a non-paper because at the end of INC4 in Ottawa at 3 a.m. when we all finished, and I have photos of myself from that time period. They are not being shared publicly. They are horrible. But at the end of that, there was a mandate to create intersessional work, but also to have the Secretariat create a compilation document of all the proposals made in Ottawa. That document was 77 pages, and even more heavily bracketed than what you saw on the screen. The chair, feeling that we would not have any momentum at INC5 if we used that, took it upon himself, which he has the authority to do, to create a non-paper, so not something that was legally mandated by the countries, but still something that in his capacity he can create, which was a set of proposals for some text and also some areas where we would still need articles to be included, but trying to set out what would be basically a basic framework for what some sense of a majority could agree on to move forward. That itself caused a great deal of debate. And when we got to Busan, we spent about the first day arguing about whether or not to use that. So telling you just how deeply ingrained the textual elements are in this. We had arguments about which text to use to start with. And we did end up using the non-paper, but then all manner of suggestions were added back in. So then we had 2 more non-papers. We had one on the 29th of November. Yes, I do know the dates, which is truly frightening, which was like the intermediate one. I felt like it was Goldilocks and the 3 Bears. I did, this one's not right, this one's not right, maybe this will work. And then on the last day, we had the 1st December proposal, a non-paper, which again shifted as well. And that was also not accepted. We didn't have enough time to really get into a lot of the treaty text. And the legal drafting group, which I sit on, which was intended to be, sounds very exotic, it's intended to be one of the most dull functions that we have. It is a group of lawyers who sit there and theoretically, if it works, are supposed to look at proposed text and go, yes, this is perfectly fine, or no, this is not in any type of semblance international law, or you said reporting every 5 years in this article, you said reporting every 3 years in this article. Fix it. It's very technical. We met once to meet each other, and that was it, because we had no text to clean, and that was the reality. So the way that we were able to end Busan and INC5, but still have negotiations, because if you remember in the beginning, I said we only had 5 rounds, was to not close the meeting, but to have the chair adjourn the meeting. Again, this is why we have lawyers. And by saying he was adjourning the meeting, it technically kept that meeting open. So we have the next session in Geneva in August, as Melissa mentioned. We hope to have treaty text. At the moment, the understanding is that the chair's non-paper from the 1st of December will be the basis for negotiating text, with a number of provisions most likely to be amplified. There is a great deal of informal intersessional work because we couldn't get agreement on formal intersessional work. So some countries have specifically been asked to handle certain things. For example, Brazil has been asked to coordinate an effort to rewrite the health article, which is in Article 19. Switzerland and Mexico will very soon be providing their views and their proposal on a high ambition element of what this might look like. And a number of other different countries are working on this as well. There are certain consultations going on at the moment, some formal, some informal, some public, some private, to try to figure out how additional text might be suggested so that we get to 5.2 with some areas of agreement. But we do have 10 negotiating days to do that in Geneva in August, when we will all want to go sit by the lake, but we will instead be working very hard in the Palais des Nations. And we will see what the outcome is at this point. We did sense at the end of 5.1, which is what we're now calling Busan, that a number of countries are very frustrated. The high ambition countries, but also the developing countries, the countries that are really most impacted, especially by the downstream, this plastic waste, where they don't have the infrastructure to handle it. So a number of the countries I work with don't have the infrastructure to take things that they find every day on the beach and actually clean them or dispose of them. And they also don't know what's in them. So they don't know what the safe way of disposing of it is. And for them, this is an existential question. It really is. And this constant kind of political game, which is quite common in treaty contexts, for them at this point is getting to be much more of a foundational issue. And so I think we'll see a lot more pushback on this and a real effort to try to come up with more solid text. Whether it works in the situation that Melissa alluded to, which is the idea that typically we have consensus. So typically everybody has to agree and vote that way, but we don't have to. There is a rules of procedure option, which technically would allow for a vote. And if it's a procedural issue, you get a majority vote. Wonderful, you're done. If it's a substantive issue, 2/3. There's a hesitation to trigger that in a lot of the multilateral environmental agreement context, so not just plastics, but a number of other different regimes. But there's also an increasing feeling that we might have to see that happen. And so if anyone wants to go to sleep, I have a number of papers that are available as legal briefs, including on this very topic, which will help many of you to take a nap if you need it, but explaining how the rules of procedure could be used to actually get voting done and what the issues might be. And there are a number of issues. Again, I could talk about it all day, so I will stop. But it is a really dynamic and changing negotiation, which I think also shows us how important plastics are to discuss, how important they are to regulate, and also personally has made me really reflect on how ingrained they are in our lives, in our daily lives, without us thinking about it. Because if this was something like mercury, which we have a convention on, which is very important, it's very dangerous, it's caused horrible, horrible health impacts and environmental impacts, but it's not as much in our daily lives. It would most likely be easier to negotiate this now. But since it is all around us, it then becomes so much harder to negotiate to figure out how we break down what we've come to depend on very quickly, but very dramatically. And I think that's what makes it so hard for the negotiations. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Alexandra. So there's been great presentations from everybody, and I have a series of questions to keep the conversation going. I just will maybe offer, if there's anyone in the audience who has a burning question, we could take that right now. We'll have a moment at the end to ask people if they have questions. So the audience online or in the room, does anyone have a burning one right this second? I see a hand in the back. Okay.
Thank you so much. I have that was fascinating and really helpful for getting a sense of the complexity. And my question is about industry, because I realized that most of the people at the table at INC5 was industry. No, is that not correct? No.
No. So the negotiating is done by countries only. And then we have what we call observers, who are basically everyone else. Now, in the observer category, there are different kind of categories themselves, subcategories. So you have UN agencies, intergovernmental organizations like IUCN, and then we did have a large number of civil society members, including industry, and there definitely were a number of industry people. I think actually industry was stronger in terms of representation in Ottawa than in Busan. But there were a number of industry representatives. Obviously, there were also a number of Indigenous community representatives, et cetera. But they were certainly present, which is another debate as to whether or not they should be, but that's a different
Thank you for that
conversation.
clarification.
So
Yes,
if I could add to that, if that's the end of the question, yeah, no, I'm just trying to get my video back on. No, they agreed. They're obviously not, the member states are the only ones that are officially negotiating. But the reality is that there is a very strong industry lobby that is present in these negotiations. Yes, there are also a lot of grassroots activists, but the number of industry lobbyists that have, especially as you noted in Ottawa, was extremely high. And at INC4, there were 196 fossil fuel and chemistry industry lobbyists registered. And so they have a lot of money, and they have, that it's something that has to be named in the process. Like I agree, it is unfortunate that we become to depend so much on plastics, but we also have to ask, why are we so dependent on plastics? And yes, there are functions for where it has become useful, and in things like the healthcare context, but there has been a deliberate attempt to make it feel like plastics is so necessary for so many aspects of our lives. It never used to be in so many different types of products. We never used to have all of this single use. And so I think it's really important to think about the role of petrochemical industry in continuing to push an addiction to plastics and make it feel like it is such an essential part of our lives. And there needs to be accountability there for the role that industry plays in where we are at this point, and the communities that are being sacrificed for continued profit for industry is a really important thing. And yeah, there's been conversations about how do we ensure that the negotiations are not influenced by industry, and it's a complicated process. And like, again, there are things that are embedded within the way the whole United Nations process functions, that it's not so simple as to just say, oh, we're going to say these particular folks can or cannot be at the table. So there's a balance of different quote unquote stakeholders and rights holders. But I think, yeah, it's just something that I think it's a good question. And I think it's something that we need to be really mindful of. And I'll take that opportunity too to mention the fact that rights holders, Indigenous peoples, are not at the table for the most part. Like we saw many Indigenous peoples asking to have the floor, having to just almost beg for 5 minutes in the plenary sessions to be able to speak, because they are not treated, they are just treated as other stakeholders in many ways in this INC process so far, and there is headway being made to change that. But I've seen so many community leaders, nation leaders, rights holders there having these press conferences outside, having these panels outside of the formal process, but not having any true mechanism to participate meaningfully and ensure that their rights are protected through the treaty process. So I took that question and swung it in a way that makes a point that I think is important.
Thanks for that. Melissa DeYoung, would you like to add anything on this?
Sorry, I was on mute. No, I don't have a strong, participation or understanding of the INC process. So not sure that I have too much to add there.
Okay, thank you. I would just mention one thing at the INC4, the one in Ottawa. When you went through the airport, which of course every international visitor would have to do, every diplomat, as you walked through the entire airport in Ottawa, every billboard was an ad for why a cucumber needed to be wrapped, why a fish needed to be wrapped, why your needles had to be wrapped, et cetera. You know, like it was every possible use explaining why you needed plastic. So they certainly have some influence.
No, and there was also, I think, the most striking one, and I think, Melissa, Gorrie, you probably saw this one too, was the one, it was in the Westin, which is the hotel attached to the conference center, and a number of other venues as well, of a little girl lying in a hospital bed in a gown, holding her teddy bear with an oxygen mask over her face. And the caption is, you know, plastic saves lives. And it was very, and yes, there is certainly a very important medical function for many plastics at this point, at least until we have an alternative. But it was so just overwhelming right here. And everyone who was a parent, a grandparent, you know, an aunt, uncle, anything, like that is a very different type of marketing and campaigning, and like a little bit below the belt, you know, it's just a little bit. So no, it was definitely, it was not there in Busan. But in Ottawa, there were also taxi cabs that had been paid to have, you know, plastic saves lives on the cabs, and people who were paid up to stand outside and have placards saying the same thing. So it was much more intense in Ottawa.
I don't know if this is, you know, how you connect this, but with the movement away from the carbon economy, it almost seems like the making of plastic is another way to use oil and gas, right? So it's kind of like, we're in this business, so let's keep in it through plastic. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that. But okay,
Sorry, I think that's a great point. Is my video going wonky? I'm worried if I start getting robotic, just it's okay. Okay. I think 100% that's a really great point, Oonagh, and that I think, you know, industry is seeing the signs on the wall about decarbonization. And so we're wanting to get away from using oil and gas for fueling our vehicles and other such things. But now the push is we need to find another way to keep production going. And again, why I highlight the importance of looking at full life cycle and not just talking about the back end waste management, and looking at what are we actually producing. And the petrochemical industry, you know, we've talked about it from an oil and gas climate angle, but I think it's really important to think of plastics is connected in to fossil fuels and petrochem, and like the same industries that folks in the climate movement have been fighting to protect us from climate change. It's the same thing in the context of plastics. And so I think the more that we draw those connections and think about strategies that address some of these underlying root issues around why do we need to continue to be so extractive and produce these, like, again, something like plastics, which it's like, for what? Like this plastic saves lives. Yeah, it also does a whole bunch of other things, and so many things that are totally unnecessary. And so why are we continuing to poison ourselves and our environment for the benefit of shareholders in these industries? And I think that it's definitely something to be really mindful of. So thanks for making that point.
Faisal.
Yeah, I have a related question, so not really a comment. So we have this like problem of representation a little bit, is what I'm understanding, that like we have member states, they're negotiating or discussing, and there's like lobbyists and like observers, but like what's hard to achieve is really like people being represented, right? Like the people who are affected every day, right? Whether it's Indigenous communities or you and I, who are eating plastics through fish. Like, we don't like this. We don't like this at all. And so here at Concordia, I have the question, or just like in Montreal, how do we like create like a representation, like a democratic like action, right? And it seems really hard to understand and to connect with, and like it's very hard to penetrate. We had a few students who are actually here with us today go to Ottawa as like representatives, observers, sorry, from Concordia. Like we realized at the last minute through their investigative work that we could send people there, that we had that option. And it was just like random, right? It was so random that we were even able to get them to go to connect just as observers. But I think they learned a lot, and it was like really important to them. They were working on plastics here at Concordia. Actually, these coasters were printed through their facility here that took plastics from Concordia and recycled them. Like a really cool initiative that they combined with education, and they're really trying their best to connect, but it's like we're not doing enough like a society, right? And we have these organizations that are also representing us in a way, right? Like Ecojustice and stuff. But anyway, so my question is, can we do better? Is there a way to have more representation of people there, or like influence? That's maybe not possible.
Do you want to try answering that question, Alexandra?
Sure.
It's a great question.
It's a wonderful question.
Yeah,
It is.
this
No,
is
it
why
is.
I do international law and art.
No, exactly.
Because there are issues.
Exactly. It's why most of us who do international law have other hobbies, right, to get us away from it for a while. No, but I think you're absolutely right. And unfortunately, the way that the structures work in the UN processes, you have to be accredited before you're able to participate. If there were a green zone, like at the climate change COPs, for example, then anyone can come in. But until we're at that point, and especially during a negotiation and we're not at that point, it is so limited. And I think you're right. There is a very big gap between what we all know and what we all experience on a day-to-day basis, and then how that goes and gets brought to the negotiations. Now, we all hope that negotiators are also people too. They experience it and they see it themselves. And we have seen a number of instances where, really there is an effort to balance a national position with a personal experience. And some of the negotiators have been very upfront about this. So actually, one of the negotiators from Iraq has been very outspoken about the impacts of plastic and other types of pollution on his family, and at the same time representing a country that is often in a very awkward position of trying to ally itself with some of the petrochemical concerns, but also trying to advance and move forward. And so it's an interesting way of kind of blending the two. But I think the way that we have the rules now, it's so difficult for citizen groups to come in, for education groups are different. And if you are considering coming to 5.2, I see smiling faces, so I'm guessing this row is your students here. Please do. We need to have your voices. Those are very important voices. But until we kind of reform that process and take down some of those barriers, it is very difficult to get those concerns in, unfortunately. It is possible in the sense of providing information. And I know no one wants to hear this. It's not a really fun option, but providing information. So fact sheets, briefs, social media posts, anything like that can be shared with negotiators, with people who are observer representatives, can then be very influential. And so like campaigns, timing of campaigns during an INC process, before the INC process, all of those things can be very helpful and impactful. They're not officially part of the process, but it's kind of like maximizing what you can do within it, which is not a satisfying answer. I know, and I'm sorry, but it's something. It is.
Yeah, and doing things like side events, right? Where you can do an online side event, like we did for the plastic meetings in Ottawa. We did it ourselves, and you get people who are negotiators who will attend it because they think it's interesting, they like some of the speakers, and so you can influence that way. So it's, using that observer status that Concordia is able to get, there's all kinds of things you could do. And then you join a group, say another university somewhere in Africa, and you say, why don't we do a side event on whatever it is, AI, and it's the sky's the limit once you get very creative. And if there is a big enough conference, there may be opportunities. I mean, I don't know if this one's not so big, right? It's
This
it's not like the climate one.
No. Once hopefully when we get to actually having the conferences of the parties, then there will be more of an opportunity to have kind of industry or university, other types of presence. So like we have for UNFCCC. But right now it's really just trying to get the treaty to get us there. But yeah, please come. Those of you who can come. Geneva's lovely in August. It is. It's hot. It's a little humid, but it's beautiful. It's stunning. And we really need your voices. We really, really do. And then the other thing I would just point out is that there are what we call major groups. So the UN Environment Program has 7 major groups. So there is one for industry, but there's also one importantly for children and youth. And so I think maybe some of you in the audience, because I was a volunteer and gave a 4-week boot camp on treaty negotiations and international law training after INC 5.1. And so that group is very active. They're very involved. They, as a major group, have the ability to speak. So while some of the individual members might not, they do. And they've been very active in making speeches and giving interventions during the process. What impact they have in terms of changing it, obviously, anyone's guess, but they are there and they are present and very vocal. And so that type of intervention is, I think, really critical as well.
I want to bring in Melissa DeYoung and Melissa Gorrie as well into the conversation. I know there was a question in the audience, Guy, I saw you, we'll get to you, I promise. But like just to connect this thing between, Faisal, you're looking at right here, Concordia University, trying to figure out what would work in terms of better reduction and recycling. And Melissa DeYoung, you're talking about the Great Lakes and how you've been able to do so much work by getting local communities involved. And Melissa Gorrie, you had the example of Edmonton, finally getting people thinking about this single-use plastic. Like, how do we connect all that grassroots activity up towards provincial governments, federal governments, international NGOs, and international negotiations? Maybe if I could turn to Melissa DeYoung first, just to comment on that.
Yeah, sure, I can jump in there. I think, the initiative that I mentioned off the top, our Great Lakes Plastic Cleanup, is a great example of how we're working to try to do exactly what you're talking about there. So, recognizing the complexity of the challenge of plastic pollution and the fact that, there's no one individual or one group that can solve the issue on their own, and that there is really a need to build out that network, which should include communities and people who are dealing with this issue firsthand on the ground. So a very big component of our work is finding ways to provide those opportunities, not only for communities or for individuals, families, to learn about plastic pollution, but to do so in a way that encourages longer-term stewardship for the environment, for our water systems. And making that connection has been shown to be a really incredible way for them to continue to push for solutions in their own communities. And, whatever they're learning through our program, they're taking back to their families, they're taking back to their friends, and they're having those types of difficult discussions that need to be had. And they're doing so in an informed way because, I think, as it's come up a number of times throughout this discussion, there is a lot of misinformation about plastic in general and about plastic pollution. So finding ways to arm people with the knowledge and information that they need to have discussions with their local MPs, have discussions with local MPPs, and figure out what matters at the local level is really important. And then I'll add through our program as well, the data that we're collecting, we're not only looking to understand what's happening at the Great Lakes or the regional level, we also use that and roll that up into international data sets. And those are really important, I think, to inform the types of discussions that happen perhaps at the INC events, but certainly with governments, different orders of government, and making sure, again, that there is a connection to science, there is a connection to data that can be used as the foundation for informed discussions about what's happening locally and making those connections, again, across sectors and across governments.
Thanks. Melissa Gorrie, would you like to comment here?
Sure. Yeah. I think the thing is that, if you look, I said, we don't want this in our food. We don't want this in our bodies. And I think there's within, you talk about grassroots and communities, like I think the average person sees this and says we need to act, right? And like there's even data out there, they've done polling and they've shown that, I think it's high 70s, even higher of Canadians wanted the federal government to act on plastic pollution, right? I think the issue isn't so much that the local communities, they're already indicating that they are concerned and they care and they want action. And I think people are acting. I think where there's, not to come back too much to industry, but you see the fact that why are there so many barriers when we have communities saying that they want action? there are things happening, but for example, the federal government, they did try to do something. They did enact regulations under CEPA, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, that would help at least address some of these, single-use items. It's not a comprehensive way of addressing plastics, but it's a really great first step. And what happened is industry came and brought forward a legal challenge. And so they've been stuck in a legal challenge for over a year, just over a few simple single-use items that should be the most easy, low-hanging fruits to address. We do not need these things. These are not essential. And industry is fighting and spending a bunch of money. And now the government is being scared away from taking any future action to continue their mandate to address plastic pollution because they know Canadians want it. So I think that's something that we need to think about is the barriers that exist, but continue to push forward and to support each other in community to find strategic ways to still ensure there's action. Obviously, the work that you're doing, Melissa, and the monitoring and the advocacy and the science, and when using Indigenous knowledge and supporting Indigenous communities and Indigenous-led approaches to identifying the problem and how we can address what existing is really important on the ground. And I think, like, for me, the work to just center, like in the context of the plastics treaty, I think that ties back to like why the average person doesn't feel like they have a voice in these international spaces, right? Like doing what we can to highlight the fact that citizens and particularly Indigenous people as right holders are not at the table, do not have the voice that they need to have, and just continuing to raise that and highlight that even in those outside spaces. Like an example, at the treaty negotiations, there were a lot of press conferences that were held by, Indigenous knowledge holders, by impacted racialized communities in the Gulf, of the US that are having these high cancer rates from these processing plants. They were just showing up, having side events. They were hosting panels. They were hosting press conferences. They were having kind of protests outside to just try to make sure that their voices are heard. And so I think that's just one of the best things the average person can do, is if the existing systems are not going to allow for their voices to be heard, is to work together to find other ways and other spaces to still get that message out there. And hopefully the media picks it up or whatever it is. And those concerns and those interests are still heard, maybe not through the halls of the UN processes, or maybe the government that you have like for me in the Alberta government, they're not listening. But working together as a community and being strategic on ways of still raising your issues and working together, I think sometimes is the best thing that you can do. It's exhausting, like trust me, it's exhausting work, but what's the alternative, right? So.
Thanks for that, Melissa. Did you want to say anything on this, Faisal? No? Okay. All right. I'm going to, I know, Sky, you've been waiting a while. Let's hear your question if there's a mic.
We'll just bring a microphone home for. Also, just wanted to mention to those of you joining us on Zoom, if you have any questions, you could pop those into the chat.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the discussion today. It was really, really enriching. I kind of have three interrelated questions that have come up through the discussion. First, I'll just make a comment that I think is really interesting and I've been thinking about, which was playing on one of the videos. There's like a TV screen in the back there with videos, and it mentioned that plastics only became widely circulated around the world in the 1960s. And like for myself, someone in my mid-20s, that is really, like I recognize that's really recent history. And so when we're talking about there is no alternative, I feel like there's like a Tina syndrome of plastic. And I think that that's really just helpful to think about, that this should be a solvable problem, and yet there are so many barriers. So the question I had, the first question was kind of a follow-up to our initial question, which is about what happens in these international negotiations. You had been mentioning that because there were a lot of barriers to having agreements on the treaty, things were being moved into more informal discussions. And also that there was a strong presence of like lobbyists who were there as observers. And so the two questions that popped in my head were, what is kind of the regulatory framework for those informal processes? Because it right away made me think of like World Trade Organization negotiations in the past and the types of power dynamics that happened there. And what kind of regulations there are in terms of like, are these lobbyists registered in the way that in Canada they would be registered? Are they present in those informal spaces? I'm just curious what happens in those informal discussions. And then secondly, I would ask for everybody, I I'm just curious to hear what your perspective is on international law in the environmental context, because it is so challenging, and what would kind of be the ideal scenario, because I think we've heard a lot about the challenges and being able to make things come through, and power dynamics between developing countries and, you know, more developed countries, quote unquote. And so I'm curious what your experience has been in that domain, what the impacts have been, and what would be the ideal framework for the future of how international law could, you know, how it's currently functioning, and how maybe what would be the ideal vision for the future for these types of international negotiations and treaties.
Okay, so we have 1,000 questions there, but I think there is at least something in there for everybody, but maybe we'd have to use fairly short answers. Can I start with you, Alexandra?
Sure. So
Okay.
I will.
Thank you.
Sorry, that's a lot of questions.
No, those are great questions.
That's good. You're curious.
So for the informal discussion, when they're doing intersessional informal work, there are no rules per se. So it's not subject to a particular process. And typically it's one country or a few countries who will try to coordinate it, who will work together. Usually at this level, it is not including outside observers or only if you by invitation. Those are really involved in the issue. And typically it isn't involving lobbyists, at least not publicly. They may be having lobbying of members before they go into those meetings. But typically at this point, it's really countries working together on text. We don't know the process. We don't really know the procedure. There isn't necessarily a set one. It's what comes up. And it's what comes up because we don't have a formal authorization for intersessional work. If we had the formal authorization, like for the Bangkok intersessional rounds, it would be very clear. And there are rules that apply and there are systems that apply, but it would be very clear. The problem with that, as much as they might be preferable in many ways, is that they also then require much more time. And often it's harder to get consensus on some aspects. And there are some countries that really only care about one or two issues in a way that other countries don't at all. So they are the ones that might be leading on those topics. Is it wonderful for transparency? Probably not. Is it good for trying to move things forward? Yes. In terms of the lobbying, there is no database of lobbyists for UN purposes, because the lobby will come in as industry will come in as an accredited organization through either the UN General Assembly or through UNEA. So they have to be accredited, as does Concordia, as does IUCN, ILA,
International Law
exactly,
Association.
all of us have to be accredited through the General Assembly or the UN Environment Program and UN Environment Assembly. So that kind of puts a limit on some of it. Now, that doesn't mean that lobbyists that is their day job can't come in under other organizations, right? And they often do. And sometimes they advise as well, just informally, governments, so outside of the formal process. But we don't have a database of these are all the people who also lobby, like we do in Canada. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. You could look at the domestic legislation may have a lobbying law like we do in Canada. Most countries would probably have that. Should I turn to Melissa Gorrie next, or Faisal, are you? Melissa, did you want to comment on?
Sure, maybe I'll take the second part of those questions in terms of international law and what you'd like to see. And I liked Oonagh's comment of there's a reason I'm doing art as well, right? Because of the frustration with the international processes. So yeah, they don't always work the best. Obviously, we're seeing with the Plastics Treaty some of the weaknesses. In terms of what I'd like to see moving forward, I think it's a state-based process. It's a colonial process. The efforts to ensure Indigenous peoples and their rights and their sovereignty are actually meaningfully represented in these processes is a real challenge. And having a real seat at the table has been something that's a struggle through all of these UN processes. So I think that's something that really needs to be grappled with if the United Nations and these international agreements are going to be defensible and relevant moving forward, right? We're talking about a lot of complex issues. And one example I'll just say is something positive, because I know I'm always kind of like Debbie Downer. I see all of the challenges, but in the Convention on Biological Diversity at one of the conferences of the parties, I think this was last year, there was like a bright spot in terms of, and I wasn't in attendance, others from my organization was, this is not my area of expertise, but I do understand that there was like a subsidiary body that was established that was specifically like a space and a body for Indigenous peoples and a way to advance Indigenous knowledge and rights through that process. So it's an example of creating more space for Indigenous leadership and Indigenous rights in the UN process. Not a perfect solution, but it's something. So I would just say that if for environmental international law to be at all relevant, at least in my perspective, like that is an issue that has to be front and center. And how are we respecting and upholding Indigenous people's rights in these spaces? And we're just seeing it really just in the plastics context, it's just fallen pretty flat to date.
Melissa DeYoung, would you like to make any comments in response to the questions?
Well, I don't know much to add again on the legal side of things, but I did want to mention, I think another important piece, and I know this has come up through those discussions, is sort of the financing side of things. Like, it's great to have ideas about how to address some of these issues and the types of initiatives that are needed, but that doesn't always mean that there's funding or financial mechanisms in place to be able to support that. So I think that's another thing that I would love to see more of moving forward, is like who do we get behind these projects and this work, and how do we find the financial resources that are needed to be able to do this in a systematic way, I should say.
Yeah, thanks for that. And Faisal, what would you like to?
I have sort of like a tangent to ask about when you were talking about the Iraqi representative and his position, as a representative and an individual and the impact on his family. It got me thinking, like, each of these people is an individual as well, and they're all like influenced by their state as well as themselves and their stories and their understanding. And when I think of like the future after this treaty, if it's successfully achieved, like it's hard to imagine, right, the world that we want. Like we have an abstract idea that we just don't want like the plastics all over the place, but then like we're being preyed upon, like our fears, it's holding us back with these ads of like that young girl might not have the plastics she needs to be treated, like, and we know that that's not what's at stake, but what are we talking about exactly? Like, where are we stuck? Like, where's our imagination stuck to help us move forward? Like, how maybe we need more examples, like of places that have successfully deplasticized, in the right ways, right? So we can be like, look, it can be done, and it's safe, and the economy there is fine, and people are getting treatments they need and using the plastics in the right way. You know what I mean? Like, do we have those examples? Is that something that's sort of missing? Is that possible?
So many questions. Did you want to add to that?
Just quickly, yeah. We do definitely need more of that. There are examples, we need more of it. And there also is just something, and again, could be another discussion, and I would love Melissa DeYoung to talk more with you on financing stuff, because that's another area of my love. But there is a lot of fear that is used about the idea of alternatives and substitutes to plastic. And there have been elements, especially in the textual draft that Melissa Gorrie showed us. In that document, there were inclusions of elements about supporting, promoting alternatives and substitutes that tend to be pulled out in the later round. And the language around that, the justification around that, is typically a concern that, well, this could be worse. We have a substitute and it could be worse than plastic. We have an alternative, we don't know its usage yet, we don't know its impact yet, so it could be worse. So on the idea that it could be worse, we don't encourage it or we don't include it. Which, yeah, there is an argument there. We might not know all of the ramifications, but it's also a way of holding us back and promoting a sense of fear of the unknown and the potential that could be even worse. Yeah, absolutely.
So we have come to the end of our time, but we certainly have not come to the end of our questions. I have several questions on my list that we didn't go through because we had such great questions from the audience. And I would just like to thank all these wonderful speakers today. You've really showed how complex this issue is, the connections between science, policy, law, and the heart, right? Like how we're all connected to it and we all care about it and we're all trying to do something about it. I just would like to thank the audience in the room and thank the audience online very much for your comments and your participation in this. And I'd invite you to look at the videos we have. There's a QR code where you can actually just get that QR code and then you can watch them at your leisure at home. We've got probably a few hours of interesting videos about aspects of both positive and horrifying aspects of the situation we're living in the Plasticocene. I think we should all get a chance to hear the music by Faisal Shennib, if we can hear a little bit of that. And please take your time, those of you who are in the room, to look around at the art and think about plastic and fill out the questionnaire. And please take these issues back to your families, your communities, your MPs, your MLAs, talk to everybody about it. It's our life, right? It's our planet. So thanks so much. That's all I have to say. Thank you. Big hand for the speakers.
Thank you, Oonagh. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your questions also. Just a note to say, we're going to leave the Zoom open because there's a second panel happening at 1:30 on the role of the arts in addressing plastic pollution. But we will be closing up the live stream, but just remember that this conversation remains available on our YouTube channel, and you should revisit it, and you should share it. And I'll see you later this afternoon. Okay, thank you.